Well, good morning and welcome back. I'm joined by Dr. Casey Harbine for another edition of Morning Rounds. Thanks for waking up with us today.
Yeah.
Today we're talking about environmental laws that have improved our health. Of course, Earth Day coming up, April 22nd.
Yeah.
So when was the first Earth Day and what was that all about?
Right. So Earth Day, the first Earth Day was April 22nd in 1970. And the 70s were at a time of a lot of environmental awareness and change in the public. Rachel Carson had published Silent Spring, which was a book kind of exposing the rampant use of pesticides and how harmful they are in 1969. And actually President Nixon signed into law in January of 1970 the Environmental Policy Act, which essentially established the Environmental Protection Agency, which was the first time it gave the federal government some power to both set standards and enforce environmental policy. And Earth Day was a time to reflect on the environment and how important a good, healthy environment is to our good health.
What are some laws developed to help keep our water clean?
So, right, you know, the first kind of clean water law was actually back as far as 1899. It was called the Refuse Act. And essentially what it found were people were throwing trash in the waterways that impaired ships and transportation in the waterways, so they said don't do that, but there was no real way to enforce it. Subsequently, there were further Clean Water Acts. In fact, in 1948 was a federal Water Pollution Act that again said you can't pour chemicals in the rivers, but really there was no body that came around and told people not to do that or had any enforcement. So it really wasn't until 1972 that we have our first Clean Water Act, which the EPA was then able to say, okay, this amount of pollution in the water is what we deem hazardous. They were a body that was able to kind of then enforce those things. Since then, there have been amendments. In '74, we have the Safe Drinking Water Act. So this was, you know, a time where water was tested for things like Giardia, E. coli, other viruses, some heavy metals. There was an amendment then in 1986 that included lead. And there have been many amendments since that time that include like the public's ability to have the right to know what's going on in their water systems. The Clean Water Act gave money to municipalities to establish sewage treatment centers, things that we think are pretty important, you know, places where especially poor municipalities weren't able to do without it. And then, you know, we think back to even Flint in 2016, there was a further amendment which said, okay, we find that there's this contaminant in our water system. We have to now mandate that they notify the public and that they're able to provide safe drinking water alternatives when there is a problem.
And then what about air pollution? What laws are there to help regulate air pollution?
Well, you know, back as far as 1955, there was a Clean Air Act, but again, that left the states in charge. And so some states might be more motivated to make sure they weren't polluting the air than others. And then again, it really wasn't until the establishment of the EPA that we could say, okay, this level is a level of pollution that we won't tolerate. So in 1970, we have our first real kind of Clean Air Act, where the EPA was able to set technology-based standards as to what is acceptable amount of pollution. And then even the last amendment that was signed by President H.W. Bush in 1990 really held companies to task for, you know, if they were polluting, they would be fined, and really tried to get them under control.
So what other laws have been developed to help protect us from the different hazards and toxins out there?
Well, it's really, you know, encouraging to see and actually kind of scary to think about. But in 1972, you know, after World War II, there was a big development in chemicals, particularly pesticides, fungicides, things like that. And it, you know, like I mentioned, Rachel Carson's book in 1969 really highlighting all the harmful effects that some of those chemicals had had on our health. And in 1972, we have the Federal Insecticide Fungicide Act that really said, you know, we need to be careful. There probably are some chemicals that shouldn't be allowed to be out there and be exposed to. In 1980, we have the Superfund site, which, you know, when we think about Butte, that was a pretty big deal. And essentially it said, you know, if there are communities that are so affected by massive hazards, They need to be identified. They need to be helped with cleaning up. And it was in 1986, after the Love Canal disaster in New York, where they realized a company all the way back in the 40s had contaminated this area, causing people to get sick with things like leukemia. Who was to be held responsible if it was something so far back? So the amendment said the federal government would then come in and help with funds for cleanup. And then back in 1990, following Exxon Valdez, President H.W. Bush signed into a law the Oil Pollution Act, which essentially said, okay, we're going to hold these companies responsible. They need to effectively work on ways of preventing spills, and if a spill happens, then they need to be responsible for compensating people and cleaning it up.
All right, well, thank you for all that information for us this morning here on Morning Rounds. If you have any questions that you would like us to answer, you can just email them right to us, morningrounds@kpax.com.